The dust in the morning room of Hartwell House had a particular quality, a fine silvery powder that clung to the faded damask of the chairs and settled in the intricate carvings of the mantelpiece. Ilara traced a line through it on the rosewood side table, her finger coming away grey. It was the dust of genteel poverty, the kind that spoke not of neglect, but of a slow, inexorable decline, a house holding its breath, waiting for the final collapse. Her sister, Serafina, never seemed to notice the dust. She sat opposite, bathed in a rare sliver of April sunlight, her hair a nimbus of spun gold, her hands gracefully occupied with a piece of embroidery she had no intention of finishing. She was the family's singular, breathtaking asset. Her beauty was a currency they had hoarded for 18 years, and the time had come to spend it. "He will be here by noon," Serafina said, her voice the lazy music of a woman who has never been denied anything. "Do try to make yourself presentable, Ilara. Not that it will matter. He will hardly have eyes for anyone but me." Ilara smoothed the skirt of her plain grey muslin dress. It was her best, mended twice at the seam beneath her arm. Presentable was a standard she had long since abandoned for the more practical goal of being invisible. "I am sure you are right, sister." "Of course I am," Serafina preened, tilting her head to admire her own reflection in the darkened glass of a wall sconce. "A duke does not travel 200 miles for a country mouse. He comes for a diamond. Father says the Duke of Blackwood is as rich as Croesus, and as cold as the grave. He needs a duchess to warm his bed and provide an heir. I am perfectly suited to the task." Ilara felt a familiar, weary pang. Serafina spoke of marriage as one might speak of a business transaction, a necessary and slightly distasteful prelude to a life of immense wealth and social power. She had never considered the man himself, Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, a figure of grim speculation in the London papers, a recluse since the tragic death of his first wife years ago, a man who, it was whispered, had a heart of stone and a temper like a winter storm. Her father, Sir Reginald, entered the room, his face a mask of strained optimism. He was a man drowning in debts, and the Duke was his last desperate lifeline. "Serafina, my jewel, you look exquisite. Ilara, you are here." He gave her a distracted nod, his gaze already flickering towards the window, towards the long, winding drive. For the next hour the house vibrated with a nervous tension. Serafina practiced her smiles, her graceful curtsies. Sir Reginald paced, polishing his spectacles with a trembling hand. Ilara simply sat, a silent observer in the corner, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was a piece of superfluous furniture, a shadow cast by her sister's brilliance. She did not resent it. She had long ago accepted her place. She was the plain one, the quiet one, the one with an unfortunate habit of reading books on botany instead of practicing her watercolors. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel sent a shockwave through the room. Serafina rose, a vision of pale silk and shimmering gold. Sir Reginald rushed to the entrance hall, his face flushed. Ilara remained seated, her heart a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. She felt a strange, inexplicable dread, a sense of a storm gathering just over the horizon. When the Duke of Blackwood was announced, he did not so much enter the room as conquer it. He was taller than she had imagined, broad-shouldered in a coat of severe black superfine that seemed to absorb the light. His face was all harsh angles and stark planes, as if carved from granite, dark hair, eyes the color of a winter sky just before a blizzard. He moved with a predator's economy of motion, his presence sucking the very air from the room. He was not handsome in the way of fashionable London dandies. He was formidable, a force of nature that had been contained barely within the confines of civilized dress. His gaze swept the room, dismissive of the shabby furniture, the faded portraits. It fell upon Serafina, who performed a flawless, deep curtsy, her lashes fluttering against her perfect porcelain cheeks. Ilara watched him, expecting to see a flicker of admiration, of desire. She saw nothing. His eyes were utterly flat, devoid of warmth or interest. It was like watching a man inspect a piece of livestock he was considering for purchase. He acknowledged her father's fawning greeting with a curt nod. Then his gaze, almost by accident, found Ilara in her shadowed corner. For a single startling second their eyes met. His were not just cold, they were empty, a void that seemed to pull at the warmth in her own soul. She felt an involuntary shiver trace its way down her spine. She saw a pain so profound, so deeply buried, it had frozen everything around it. Then he looked away, as if she were no more significant than the dusty side table she sat beside. "My daughter, Serafina," Sir Reginald gushed, gesturing to his beautiful child as a showman might present his star attraction. The Duke inclined his head. "Miss Hartwell." Serafina smiled, her most dazzling, practiced smile. "Your Grace, we are so honored by your visit. I trust your journey was not too arduous?" "It was adequate," the Duke said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. The conversation, if it could be called that, was a stilted affair. Serafina deployed all her charms, her witty anecdotes, her practiced laughter. The Duke responded with monosyllables, his gaze distant, his posture unyielding. Ilara watched, fascinated and appalled. It was like watching a songbird try to charm a hawk. The hawk was simply waiting for the song to end. Then came the moment that shattered the carefully constructed fantasy. Serafina, growing desperate in the face of his indifference, reached out and placed a delicate hand on his arm. "Your Grace, you are so serious. Surely even a duke must smile sometimes." Her tone was playful, coquettish, the tone she used to wrap lesser men around her little finger. The Duke froze, his entire body went rigid. He looked down at her hand on his sleeve as if it were a viper. The temperature in the room plummeted. When he raised his eyes to hers, the emptiness was gone, replaced by something far more terrifying, a flash of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Remove your hand, madam," he said, his voice soft, yet carrying the lethal edge of a razor. Serafina snatched her hand back as if burned, her face flooding with crimson. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Sir Reginald looked as if he might faint. The Duke's gaze moved from the humiliated Serafina, past the apoplectic Sir Reginald, and once again found Ilara. This time, his look was different. It was appraising, calculating. It was the look of a man reconsidering his options. He was not looking at her as a woman. He was looking at her as a solution to a problem. He turned to Sir Reginald, his expression unreadable. "Sir Reginald, I believe we have business to discuss in private." Her father, stumbling over his own feet in his haste to agree, led the Duke into his study. The door closed with a dreadful finality. Serafina, her face a mask of fury and shame, let out a choked sob and fled the room. Ilara remained in her chair, her body cold, her mind reeling. She did not know what had just transpired, not truly. But she knew that the world had just tilted on its axis. The hawk had not chosen the songbird. It had turned its chilling gaze upon the mouse in the corner. An hour later, her father summoned her. He was standing by the window in his study, his shoulders slumped. The Duke was gone. The room smelled faintly of expensive leather and cold finality. "Ilara," her father began, his voice hoarse. He couldn't meet her eyes. "The Duke, he has made an offer." She waited, her hands folded before her, a strange calm settling over her. "He finds Serafina unsuitable," he finally managed to say, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "He says her temperament would not be conducive to the tranquility of his household." Ilara thought of Serafina's practiced charms, her shallow vanity. The Duke had seen through it all in an instant. "He requires a duchess," her father continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "A wife to manage his home, to serve as a hostess when required, and to provide him with an heir. He has stipulated that he requires someone quiet, sensible, undemanding." He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were filled with a terrible, pleading pity. "He has made an offer for your hand, Ilara." The room seemed to shrink around her. The dust motes dancing in the sunbeam outside the window froze in mid-air. Her, the plain, overlooked Ilara, a duchess? It was a farce, a cruel joke. He was very clear about the terms, her father pressed on, his desperation making him cruel. "It is a marriage of convenience, a contract. He has offered to settle all my debts, to restore Hartwell, to provide you with a generous settlement of your own. Your life would be one of immense privilege." "And what does he ask in return?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. "Your compliance," her father said bluntly. "He has no interest in affection. He made it quite clear that he will be a husband in name and duty only. He requires a duchess who will understand the boundaries and respect them, who will not make emotional demands." He was offering her a gilded cage, a life of cold luxury in exchange for herself. She looked at her father's ravaged face, at the threadbare cuffs of his coat. She thought of the house groaning under the weight of its own decay. She thought of Serafina's hysterical sobs from upstairs. Her sister's vanity had ruined them, and her own invisibility, her quiet nature, was now being offered up as the sacrifice to save them. There was no choice. There never had been. Her life had been a long training in the art of quiet acceptance. "I will do my duty, father," she said, her voice steady, though her heart felt as if it had been encased in ice. He sagged with relief, a wave of gratitude so profound it made her feel sick. He had sold his daughter, and he was grateful for the price. Later that evening, a messenger arrived from the nearest town. He bore a heavy cream envelope sealed with a severe black wax seal, the ducal crest of Blackwood, a raven with its wings unfurled. Inside, on a single sheet of thick paper, was a note written in a stark, angular hand. "Miss Hartwell, our arrangement is settled. Be ready to travel in 1 week's time. My solicitor will handle all necessary legalities. I expect punctuality. Blackwood." There was no salutation, no warmth, No sentiment. It was a summons, a command. Ilara folded the note, the sharp edges of the paper digging into her palm. In 1 week, she would leave the dusty, crumbling world she knew and enter the cold, empty domain of the Duke of Blackwood. She would become his Duchess, a Duchess they never thought would be, and as she stood there in the deepening twilight, she felt not a flicker of triumph. Only the profound, chilling certainty that she had just exchanged one prison for another, far grander and infinitely more lonely. The journey north was a blur of grey skies and rattling carriage wheels. Ilara sat opposite Agnes, her maid, and the closest thing she had to a friend, her few belongings packed into a single worn trunk. Agnes, a woman of stout heart and even stouter opinions, had been uncharacteristically silent for most of the trip, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "It's not right, my lady," she finally burst out as they crossed a stone bridge over a rushing, peat-stained river. "Selling you off like a prize heifer. And to him, they say his heart is a block of ice." "It is a duke's heart, Agnes." "Perhaps they are all made of ice," Ilara replied, her voice carefully neutral. She watched the landscape change, the gentle hills of the south giving way to rugged, windswept moorland, dotted with granite outcroppings and hardy, twisted trees. It was a land that brooked no sentimentality, much like the man who was its master. Blackwood Manor appeared suddenly, a vast Gothic pile of grey stone rising from the moor like a natural feature of the landscape. It was not beautiful. It was immense, intimidating, a fortress built to withstand not just enemies, but the very elements themselves. Dozens of chimneys clawed at the sky, but only a few trailed thin wisps of smoke. Most of the windows were dark, like vacant eyes. It looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum. As the carriage drew to a halt before the massive oak doors, they swung open and a line of servants stood waiting, as still and silent as statues. At their head was a severe-looking woman in black bombazine, her grey hair pulled into a knot so tight it seemed to pull her face taut. "Her Grace, the Duchess of Blackwood," the footman announced, his voice echoing in the cavernous entrance hall. The title felt alien, a costume she was wearing. The housekeeper, who introduced herself as Mrs. Gable, curtsied stiffly. "Welcome to Blackwood, Your Grace. The Duke is in his study. He has requested that you be shown to your rooms." There was no welcome from her husband, no greeting, only a summons deferred. The wing she was led to was opulent in a cold, formal way. The furniture was heavy mahogany, the carpets were thick, the tapestries depicted grim hunting scenes. It was all impeccably maintained, yet felt entirely unused. Her chambers consisted of a sitting room, a bedroom, and a dressing room, all overlooking a vast formal lawn that eventually gave way to the wildness of the moor. The rooms were connected by a short corridor to another identical suite. A communicating door between the two bedrooms was firmly, unambiguously locked. "His Grace's chambers are through there," Mrs. Gable said, her expression unreadable. "Dinner is served at 8. The Duke expects you to be prompt." And with that, she was left alone in the echoing silence of her new life. Agnes set about unpacking, her movements brisk and angry, the snap of linen a small rebellion against the oppressive quiet. Ilara walked to the window. The sky was the color of slate, and a fine misting rain had begun to fall, blurring the edges of the world. She was a stranger here, a necessary component in a machine she did not understand. Her purpose was clear: to be quiet, to be sensible, to produce an heir. Her husband had not even bothered to see her. That evening she dressed for dinner with a sense of dread. She chose a simple gown of deep blue velvet, a color that she hoped would make her look dignified rather than insignificant. Promptly at 8, she made her way to the dining hall. It was a room built for feasting, with a table that could easily seat 50. Tonight, 2 places were set, one at either end, a vast expanse of polished mahogany separating them. The Duke was already there, standing by the fireplace, one hand resting on the marble mantel. He turned as she entered. He was dressed in black evening attire, the stark white of his shirt making his face seem even more pale and severe. "Your Grace," she said, offering a small curtsy. "Duchess," he acknowledged with a slight inclination of his head. "You are punctual. I appreciate that." He did not compliment her dress. He did not ask about her journey. He gestured to the far end of the table, and they took their seats. The meal was served by silent footmen, a succession of exquisite dishes that Ilara barely tasted. The silence between them was not awkward. It was a solid, tangible thing, a third presence at the table. He ate with an efficient, focused grace, his attention on his plate, never on her. She found herself studying him, trying to find a crack in the granite facade. His hands were long-fingered and strong, a small faded scar cut through his left eyebrow, a tiny imperfection in the otherwise harsh symmetry of his face. She wondered how he had gotten it. She wondered if he had ever laughed. The thought was so incongruous, it was almost absurd. Finally, when the dessert plates had been cleared, he spoke. "I trust your rooms are satisfactory." It was not a question so much as a statement of fact. "They are, Your Grace." "Thank you. Mrs. Gable will apprise you of your duties. You will have an allowance, which you will find to be more than generous. You may order whatever you wish in terms of wardrobe or furnishings for your own use. The rest of the house is to remain as it is." His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. "I spend most of my time in my study or in the East Wing. I will not disturb you, and I expect the same courtesy in return." It was a speech of demarcation, of drawing borders. "This is my space, that is yours. Let us not trespass." "I understand," she said softly. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, for the first time since their disastrous meeting at Hartwell. His grey eyes were like probes, searching for any sign of weakness, of dissent. "This is an arrangement, Duchess, a contract for our mutual benefit. You will provide me with a legitimate heir. In return, you will have security, title, and wealth beyond anything you have known. Let us not complicate it with sentiment. It is a commodity in which I do not trade." The sheer, brutal honesty of it stole her breath. He was warning her, drawing the lines of their prison. "Do not ask for more. Do not hope for more. There is nothing more to be had." "I understand my duties, Your Grace," she repeated, her voice a little stronger this time. She would not let him see her fear, her desolation. She was a Hartwell. They endured. He seemed satisfied with her answer. He rose from his chair. "Good. Then we have an understanding." Without another word, he turned and left the dining hall, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor until they were swallowed by the vast silence of the house. Ilara remained at the table, a lone figure in a cavernous room. The candles flickered, casting long dancing shadows on the walls. She was the Duchess of Blackwood. She had a title, a grand house, unimaginable wealth, and she had never, in her entire life, felt so utterly alone. The days that followed settled into a cold, predictable rhythm. Ilara took her meals alone in a small morning room, as the Duke kept to his own schedule. She saw him only occasionally, a glimpse of his tall figure disappearing down a corridor, the sound of his study door closing with quiet finality. They were two ghosts haunting the same house, their paths rarely crossing. Mrs. Gable, the formidable housekeeper, was her primary guide to this new world. She instructed Ilara on the management of the household accounts, the planning of menus, the direction of the vast staff. Ilara, with her quiet intelligence and methodical nature, took to the tasks with a surprising aptitude. It was a relief to have something to occupy her mind, a set of problems to which there were logical, unemotional solutions. She earned Mrs. Gable's grudging respect, if not her warmth, but the house itself remained a mystery. It was a place of profound, suffocating sorrow. The servants moved like shadows, speaking in hushed tones. There was no laughter, no music, no life. The East Wing, where the Duke spent most of his time, was a forbidden territory. Ilara learned from a nervous housemaid that it had been the late Duchess's wing. It had been kept locked and untouched since her death 5 years ago, a shrine to a ghost. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the oppressive stillness of the house, Ilara wandered into the extensive grounds. She followed a flagstone path, overgrown with moss, that led her past the formal lawns and into a part of the estate that had clearly been left to ruin. She pushed her way through a rusty iron gate, its hinges groaning in protest, and found herself in what must have once been a magnificent garden. It was now a wilderness. Rose bushes, unpruned for years, had grown into thorny, tangled thickets. Weeds choked what were once flower beds. A central fountain, its stone cherub cracked and weather-beaten, was dry and filled with dead leaves. It was a place of profound neglect, a mirror to the heart of the house itself. Yet, even in its decay, there was a ghost of its former beauty. A single stubborn climbing rose had managed to produce a few pale, fragrant blossoms. A patch of bluebells had survived, a small lake of color in a sea of green and brown. As she stood there, taking in the melancholic scene, she heard a sound, a tiny sniffle. She turned and saw, half hidden behind a crumbling stone bench, a small child, a little girl, no older than 5 or 6. With dark, solemn eyes and a tumble of black curls that mirrored the Duke's. She was wearing a simple white frock, and she was watching Ilara with a wide, unblinking stare. Ilara's heart gave a sudden, painful lurch. This must be Rosamond, the Duke's daughter. No one had mentioned her. It was as if she too were a ghost. "Hello," Ilara said softly, her voice gentle so as not to startle the child. The little girl didn't answer. She simply stared, her expression a curious mixture of fear and curiosity. A woman, her nursemaid by her dress, hurried into the garden. "Lady Rosamond, you are not to wander off," the nursemaid scolded, her voice sharp with anxiety. She saw Ilara and immediately dropped into a flustered curtsy. "Your Grace, I do apologize. She is quiet." Ilara looked from the nervous nursemaid to the silent child. Rosamond's eyes, so like her father's, held a deep, ancient sadness that no child should possess. "It's quite all right," Ilara said. "This is a lovely spot." She looked around at the ruin of the garden. It must have been beautiful once. The nursemaid's face softened for a moment. It was the first Duchess. She loved this garden. It was her creation. And now it was a ruin, just like the family. The first Duchess's garden, the first Duchess's wing. Her presence was everywhere, a ghost whose sorrow still held the house in its grip. The child, Rosamond, took a hesitant step forward. She pointed a small finger at the single blooming rose. She still didn't speak, but her meaning was clear. Yes, Ilara said, her voice catching. It's a beautiful rose, isn't it? Rosamond gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, then allowed her nursemaid to take her hand and lead her away. She glanced back once over her shoulder, her dark, solemn eyes fixed on Ilara. That night, Ilara lay awake in her cold, lonely bed, the image of the silent child and the ruined garden fixed in her mind. For the first time since her arrival, she felt something other than fear or resignation. It was a flicker of purpose, a tiny seed of an idea taking root in the barren soil of her existence at Blackwood. She would not be a ghost in this house of ghosts. She would not succumb to the suffocating sorrow. She would do something. She would bring the garden back to life. Not for the Duke, not to impress him or win his favor, but for the sad-eyed child who had noticed a single beautiful rose in the midst of all that decay. And perhaps, just perhaps, for herself as well. It would be a quiet act of defiance. A small patch of the world that she could tend and make beautiful, a place where things could grow again. The next morning, Ilara sought out Mrs. Gable. "I wish to restore the walled garden behind the west lawn," she announced, her voice betraying none of the nervousness she felt. The housekeeper's eyebrows shot up. "Your Grace, that garden has been left to nature for 5 years. It is a wilderness." "Then I shall tame it," Ilara said simply. "I will require gardening tools, and I would like to request the assistance of one of the under-gardeners, if one can be spared." Mrs. Gable looked at her as if she had sprouted a second head. Ladies, duchesses did not engage in manual labor. They did embroidery. They arranged flowers that others had cut for them. "I will have to inform His Grace," she said stiffly. "Of course," Ilara replied, though a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She fully expected a curt refusal, another border drawn around her existence. To her surprise, the message that came back from the Duke, delivered via a footman, was a single word: "Proceed." And so her project began. Dressed in a sturdy old gown and armed with thick leather gloves, Ilara entered the forgotten garden. The first few days were brutal, back-breaking work. She, along with a shy young gardener named Thomas, hacked away at the thorny brambles, pulled up endless weeds, and cleared away years of accumulated debris. Her hands, accustomed to books and teacups, became chapped and blistered. Her muscles ached in ways she had never imagined, but with the pain came a profound sense of satisfaction. With every weed she pulled, every overgrown branch she clipped, she felt as though she were clearing away some of the suffocating inertia that had settled over her own spirit. She was imposing order on chaos, bringing light to a place that had been shrouded in darkness. The child, Rosamond, became a frequent visitor. She would stand at the edge of the garden with her nursemaid, a silent little sentinel watching Ilara work. She never spoke, but her presence was a constant, quiet encouragement. One afternoon, as Ilara was struggling to turn over a patch of hard, compacted soil, Rosamond walked hesitantly onto the cleared earth. She knelt down and with her small bare hands began to pull at a stubborn dandelion root. Ilara paused, her heart swelling. "Thank you, Rosamond," she said softly. The little girl looked up, her dark eyes solemn. She gave another of her tiny, almost invisible nods, and then went back to her task. It was the beginning of their silent partnership. From that day on, Rosamond was her small shadow in the garden, helping in her own quiet way, her presence a fragile thread of connection in the lonely tapestry of Blackwood. She rarely saw the Duke, but she knew he was aware of her activities. Sometimes from the corner of her eye she would see a curtain move in a window of the main house, a tall, dark figure standing in silhouette against the light. He never approached, he never spoke of it, but he was watching. One evening, after a long day of toil, she returned to her rooms to find a collection of books on her sitting room table. They were old, leather-bound volumes, their pages filled with intricate botanical drawings, the principles of English gardening, a compendium of heritage roses, the language of flowers. There was no note, but she knew with an absolute certainty who had left them there. She ran her fingers over the tooled leather spine of the rose compendium. It was not praise. It was not encouragement, not in any conventional sense. It was a silent, practical acknowledgement, a supplying of tools for a task he had permitted. It was the first gesture he had made towards her that was not a command or a statement of terms. It was a glimmer, a tiny, unexpected flicker of light in the vast, cold darkness of their arrangement. She opened the book, and as the scent of old paper and pressed flowers filled the air, She felt a strange and unfamiliar emotion begin to stir within her. It was not happiness, not yet, but it felt something like hope. The restoration of the garden became Ilara's world. Through the turning of spring into summer, she and the young gardener Thomas, with Rosamond as their silent apprentice, worked tirelessly. They uncovered the original flagstone paths, repaired the crumbling stone walls, and cleared the fountain, which, after some work on the ancient plumbing, now trickled with clean, clear water. The sound, after years of silence, was like the house taking its first breath. Ilara discovered a new side of herself in the rich soil of the garden. She was not just a quiet, sensible woman. She was patient, determined, and possessed a deep, intuitive understanding of what the neglected plants needed to thrive. She spent her evenings poring over the books the Duke had left for her, learning the names of forgotten roses, the needs of delicate perennials. Her allowance, once a symbol of her gilded cage, was now spent on seeds and rootstock, on tools and trellises. Her connection with Rosamond deepened, a bond forged not in words, but in shared tasks. Ilara would show the little girl how to gently loosen a seedling from its pot, how to press a seed into the earth. Rosamond, in turn, would point out a ladybird on a leaf, or bring Ilara a perfectly formed heart-shaped stone she had found. They communicated in a language of their own, a quiet understanding that bypassed the need for speech. Ilara began to see flickers of the child beneath the sad, silent facade. A brief, fleeting smile when a butterfly landed on her hand. A small gasp of delight when the first sweet pea tendril curled around the string Ilara had tied for it. The Duke remained a distant, watchful presence. He never entered the garden, never spoke of her work, but the silent offerings continued. A rare catalogue from a Dutch bulb merchant appeared on her breakfast tray. A new, lighter spade and fork, perfectly sized for a woman's hands, were left leaning against the garden gate one morning. Each gesture was impersonal, practical, yet they were threads of connection, however thin. She was an object of his observation, a project whose progress he monitored with a detached scientific curiosity. She learned more about him from the house itself than from the man. She learned he was a creature of rigid routine, that he read late into the night, that he favored solitude above all else. From a hushed conversation between two maids, she learned that the anniversary of the first Duchess's death was approaching, a day when the entire manor held its breath, when the Duke would lock himself in the east wing and see no one. The sorrow in the house was not just an atmosphere, it was an active, living thing, with its own dark anniversaries. One sun-drenched afternoon in late July, as Ilara was staking delphiniums, she was startled by the sound of a voice from the garden gate, a voice that was achingly, horribly familiar. "Well, well, look at you, sister, playing the humble peasant. How utterly quaint." Ilara turned, her heart sinking. Serafina stood there, dressed in the height of London fashion, a confection of ruffled silk and lace that was utterly incongruous in the rustic setting. She looked Ilara up and down, her lip curled in a delicate sneer. "So this is what a Duchess of Blackwood does with her time, digging in the dirt like a common dairymaid. Father would be mortified." "Serafina," Ilara said, her voice tight, "what are you doing here?" "Visiting my dear sister, of course," she purred, strolling into the garden, her silk slippers ill-suited to the gravel path. "I was in the neighborhood, visiting the Marchioness of Claremont, and I couldn't possibly pass by without seeing how you were settling into your grand new life." Her eyes swept over the burgeoning flower beds with a dismissive air. "All this effort, I suppose a plain woman must cultivate other hobbies." Rosamond, who had been quietly watering a patch of pansies, froze at the sight of the glittering stranger. She scurried behind Ilara's skirts, her small hand clutching the fabric. Serafina's sharp eyes noticed the movement. "And what is this? Don't tell me the little wraith is yours." "This is Lady Rosamond," Ilara said, her voice turning to ice. She placed a protective hand on the child's head. "The Duke's daughter." "Ah, yes, the silent child," Serafina said with a cruel little smile. "I heard the first wife left behind a broken little doll. Still not talking, is she? How dreary." She bent down, her voice falsely sweet. "Cat got your tongue, little one." Rosamond shrank further behind Ilara, her small body trembling. Ilara straightened to her full height. The diffident, overlooked sister was gone, replaced by a duchess defending her charge. "That is enough, Serafina. Your visit is over." Serafina laughed, a high, brittle sound. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Ilara. You may have snagged the title, but you'll never be anything more than the helpmeet, a glorified housekeeper. He married you for your silence and your sensible shoes. He would have married me for my beauty had I been willing to tolerate his boorish moods." The argument was cut short by the arrival of the Duke himself. He appeared at the gate as silently as a wraith. his presence immediately dominating the space. His face was a thundercloud, his grey eyes glacial. He had clearly overheard his sister-in-law's final words. "You find my moods boorish, Miss Hartwell?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. Serafina paled, her bravado vanishing like smoke. "Your Grace, I was just jesting with my sister." "I do not jest," he said, his gaze flicking to Rosamond, who was still hiding behind Elara, and then to Elara's protective stance. An almost imperceptible muscle twitched in his jaw. "And I do not appreciate uninvited guests who upset the members of my household." His eyes met Serafina's, and they were filled with a cold dismissal that was far more insulting than any shout. "Your carriage is waiting. Do not return to Blackwood." It was an exile, delivered in a calm, lethal tone. Serafina, for the first time in her life, was rendered speechless, her face mottled with fury and humiliation. She shot Elara a look of pure venom, then turned on her heel and swept out of the garden, her silk dress rustling with indignation. A tense silence fell. Elara's heart was hammering against her ribs. She had never seen him so angry, yet he had not raised his voice. It was a controlled, contained rage that was all the more frightening for its stillness. He had defended her. He had defended Rosamond. He had referred to them, together, as members of my household. It was an alliance, forged in the face of a common enemy. He looked at Elara, his expression unreadable. His gaze dropped to her dirt-smudged hands, then to the trembling child at her side. "Is the child all right?" he asked, his voice stiff as if the words were unfamiliar. "She was frightened," Elara replied. "She will be fine." He gave a curt nod. He seemed about to say something more, something personal, but the habit of a lifetime of emotional austerity was too strong. The shutters came down over his eyes again. He turned to leave. "Your Grace!" Elara called out, surprising herself with her own boldness. He stopped, his back to her. "Thank you," she said quietly. He did not turn around. For a long moment he stood perfectly still. Then, without a word, he walked away, his tall figure disappearing behind the high stone wall, leaving Elara and Rosamond alone in the sun-drenched, silent garden. The crisis had passed, but the air still crackled with the aftershock. He had drawn a line in the sand, placing her and his daughter on one side, and the hostile outside world, even in the form of her own sister, on the other. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was a kind of protection. And for the first time, Blackwood Manor felt a little less like a prison and a little more like a fortress they might defend together. The aftermath of Serafina's visit left a strange quiet in its wake. The Duke retreated even further into his solitude, the brief connection in the garden severed by his habitual reserve. Yet something had shifted. The borders he had so carefully drawn had been breached, not by her but by him. In defending her, he had acknowledged her place in his life beyond the cold terms of their contract. The approaching anniversary of the first Duchess's death cast a lengthening shadow over the household. The servants grew more hushed, their movements more furtive. Mrs. Gable's face was etched with a grim resignation. Elara felt the tension like a drop in atmospheric pressure, a storm gathering just out of sight. On the morning of the anniversary, the house was as still as a tomb. A heavy, persistent rain began to fall, drumming against the window panes and turning the world outside to a wash of grey. The Duke did not appear for breakfast. He did not emerge from the east wing at all. Elara found she could not settle. The garden was a sodden mess, offering no escape. She paced the length of her sitting room, the silence of the house pressing in on her. She thought of the man, locked away with his grief, a prisoner of a past she could not begin to understand. Rosamond was listless and pale, her usual quietness replaced by a visible anxiety. She refused to eat, pushing her food around her plate with a tiny fork. Late in the afternoon, her nursemaid came to Elara in a state of distress. "It's Lady Rosamond, Your Grace. She's developed a fever. She keeps asking for her father." Elara hurried to the nursery. The little girl was flushed, her breathing shallow, her dark eyes glassy with fever. She was muttering a string of near-inaudible words. Elara leaned closer to hear. "Papa, the door locked." A cold dread washed over Elara. The child was reliving a memory, a trauma connected to this very day. "I must fetch the Duke," Elara said, her decision immediate and absolute. "But Your Grace," the nursemaid protested, "no one disturbs him today. He has forbidden it." "His daughter is ill," Elara stated, her voice leaving no room for argument. "He will see her." She walked with purpose through the silent, echoing corridors, towards the forbidden east wing. The air grew colder, more still as she approached. The door to the wing was heavy oak, and as the nursemaid had said, it was locked. Elara knocked, her knuckles rapping sharply against the wood. There was no answer. She knocked again, harder this time. "Your Grace! Alistair! It is Rosamond! She is ill!" Still only silence. A desperate resolve hardened within her. She would not be ignored. She would not let that child suffer alone. while her father walled himself up with his ghosts. She rattled the heavy iron handle, her voice rising with an urgency she didn't know she possessed. "Alistair, for the love of God, open this door!" Finally, she heard the sound of a key grating in the lock. The door swung open, the Duke stood before her, and the sight of him made her gasp. He was not the cold, controlled man she knew. His hair was disheveled, his coat discarded, his eyes were haunted, hollowed out by a grief so raw and profound it was terrifying to behold. The room behind him was a library, but it was shrouded in dust cloths, everything preserved as if in a tomb, except for a single portrait above the mantelpiece. A portrait of a woman with laughing eyes and a radiant smile, her arms full of roses, the first Duchess. "What is it?" he asked, his voice a raw rasp. "It's Rosamond," Ilara said, her own voice softening in the face of his naked pain. "She has a fever. She's calling for you. She is frightened." His haunted gaze focused on her, as if seeing her for the first time. The anger she had expected was not there, only a deep, bottomless weariness. He seemed to sway on his feet. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of profound desperation. "The fever always comes on this day," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "She remembers." Without another word, he followed her from the room, leaving the door to the shrine unlocked behind him. He walked like a man in a trance, his steps heavy. In the nursery, he knelt by his daughter's bed. "Rosamond," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He touched her forehead, his large, gentle hand dwarfing her small face. The child's eyes fluttered open. "Papa," she whimpered. "The door was locked." A spasm of pain crossed the Duke's face. He looked at Ilara, his eyes pleading, as if begging her to understand a story he could not bring himself to tell. They sat with the child through the long night as the storm raged outside. Ilara bathed Rosamond's face with cool water, while the Duke held her hand, murmuring soft, soothing words in a low voice. In the shared, quiet vigil, the walls between them crumbled. He was not the cold Duke of Blackwood, and she was not the sensible Duchess of his arrangement. They were simply two people, united in their concern for a sick child. As dawn approached, the fever broke. Rosamond's breathing evened out, and she fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. The rain had stopped, and the first pale light of morning filtered through the window. The Duke slumped in his chair, his face grey with exhaustion and relief. He looked at Ilara, his eyes raw with unshed tears. "You should not have had to see me like that," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I am your wife," she replied softly. "I am here." He stared at her, a long, searching look. Then he nodded, as if coming to a decision. "Come with me," he said. He led her back to the east wing, back to the library where the portrait of the laughing woman held court. The room smelled of dust and roses, and years of untouched sorrow. "Her name was Isabel," he said, his voice breaking on the name. "She was everything, full of life, of light. She created the garden. She filled this house with laughter." He began to speak, and the story of his past, the source of all his pain, came pouring out. He told her of their whirlwind romance, of their deep love. He told her of Rosamond's birth, and how a shadow had fallen over Isabel afterwards, a melancholy that no doctor could explain, a sadness that deepened into a despair he could not reach. "She loved the garden," he said, his gaze fixed on the portrait. "It was her sanctuary, but after Rosamond was born, she started to say the flowers were mocking her, that their beauty was a lie." His voice dropped lower, thick with a guilt that had been poisoning him for 5 years. "On this day, 5 years ago, we had an argument. I was frustrated. I didn't understand her despair. I told her she had everything a woman could want. I told her to be grateful." He closed his eyes, the memory too painful to bear. "I left. I went riding to clear my head. When I returned, she was gone." He gestured to the window which overlooked the ruined garden. "She took her own life in the garden, her sanctuary." The terrible, suffocating sorrow of the house suddenly had a name, a face, a story. Ilara felt a wave of compassion so immense it almost brought her to her knees. "Rosamond found her," he continued, his voice cracking. "She was only a baby. She had toddled out after her mother. I found them both there, and Rosamond. She hasn't spoken a full sentence since. On this day, every year, the memory returns to her as a fever. The memory of a locked door, the nursery door. The nursemaid had locked it to keep her from wandering, but Isabel had unlocked it to say goodbye." He finally looked at Ilara, his granite facade completely shattered, his eyes reflecting a pain so profound it was a physical wound. "I locked this wing. I let the garden die. I thought if I could erase her, I could erase the pain, the guilt. I thought I could build a wall of ice around my heart so I would never feel anything again. I failed her, and I have been failing my daughter ever since." Ilara didn't think. She acted. She stepped forward and took his hand. His fingers were like ice, but they curled around hers, clinging to her as a drowning man clings to a lifeline. "You did not fail her," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "You loved her, and you were lost in a storm you couldn't navigate. The guilt is the wall, Alistair, not the ice." He looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. He saw no pity in her eyes, no judgment, only a deep, quiet strength and a profound, unwavering compassion. For the first time since she had arrived at Blackwood, he truly saw her, not as a solution, not as a duchess, but as Ilara, a woman who had quietly, patiently tended his neglected garden, his neglected child, and now was tending to his neglected, shattered heart. He raised his other hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, a spark of warmth in the cold, sorrowful room. It was a gesture of incredible vulnerability, of nascent tenderness. The rigid control he had maintained for 5 years had finally completely broken. In the dusty, silent shrine to his past, surrounded by the ghosts of his grief, a tentative, fragile connection to the future was being forged. The turning point had been reached, not in a grand declaration, but in a shared vigil, a devastating confession, and a simple, compassionate touch. The days following the Duke's confession were quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. The oppressive, sorrowful silence had been replaced by a fragile, tentative peace. The door to the east wing remained unlocked. The ghost of Isabel was still there, but her memory was no longer a source of terrifying grief, but one of gentle, profound sadness. Alistair, he had asked her to call him Alistair, began to emerge from his shell. He started taking his meals with her, not at opposite ends of the vast dining table, but side by side at a small table in the morning room, the sun streaming in through the tall windows. Their conversations were stilted at first, explorations of a new and unfamiliar territory. They spoke of books, of the estate, of the progress in the garden. He listened, truly listened when she spoke, his grey eyes watching her with a new intensity, an unguarded curiosity. He began to spend time with Rosamond. He would join Ilara and the child in the garden, not to watch from a distance, but to sit on the repaired stone bench. One afternoon, to Ilara's astonishment, he knelt in the dirt beside his daughter and helped her plant a row of marigolds. He showed her how to make a hole with her finger and tuck the seedling in, his large, scarred hands moving with surprising gentleness next to her tiny ones. Rosamond, in return, began to blossom. A week after the fever, she spoke her first clear word to Ilara. She had been holding a newly opened rose, a deep crimson variety Ilara had cultivated from an old rootstock. She held it up for Ilara to smell and whispered, "Pretty." The single word was a miracle, a testament to the healing that was slowly, quietly taking place. Ilara felt her own heart beginning to thaw. The quiet, sensible Duchess was giving way to a woman who was discovering her own capacity for joy, for tenderness. She found herself watching Alistair, noticing the way a rare, fleeting smile would touch the corner of his mouth when Rosamond laughed, the way his brow would furrow in concentration when he read, the deep, rumbling timbre of his voice when he spoke of things that mattered to him, tenant farmers, crop rotation, the history of his lands. She was beginning to see the man behind the Duke, the man who had loved so fiercely and grieved so deeply. The physical space between them also began to shrink. A hand offered to help her over a stile during a walk, his arm brushing hers as they looked at a map of the estate, small incidental touches that sent a jolt of awareness through her. The memory of his hand on her cheek in the dusty library was a constant, warm presence in the back of her mind. One evening, a month after the storm had broken, both literally and figuratively, he sought her out after dinner. She was in the main library, a vast 2-story room filled with the scent of leather and beeswax. Reading one of the gardening books he had given her, he stood before her chair, looking unusually hesitant. "Ilara, will you walk with me?" She put down her book, her heart giving a hopeful leap. Of course, he did not lead her out to the moors, but towards the walled garden. It was a warm, late summer evening. The sky was a velvet canvas of indigo and violet, pricked with the first stars. The air was heavy with the scent of nightstock and roses. The garden, once a symbol of neglect and sorrow, was now a riot of color and life under the pale light of the rising moon. The gentle splash of the fountain was the only sound. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, following the flagstone paths she had so painstakingly cleared. The garden was her creation, her triumph, but she knew it had become something more. It was a sanctuary for all of them. Alistair stopped by the central fountain. He looked around at the trellises heavy with climbing roses, at the neat rows of lavender and delphiniums, at the healthy, vibrant life that had sprung from the decay. "Isabel would have loved what you've done here," he said, his voice soft. He spoke his late wife's name without the crushing weight of guilt, but with a gentle, sad acceptance. "You brought it back to life. You brought everything back to life. He turned to face her. The moonlight silvered the harsh angles of his face, softening them, revealing the vulnerability that still lay beneath the surface. His grey eyes, which she had once thought so cold, were filled with a profound warm emotion that made her breath catch in her throat. "When I proposed our arrangement," he began, his voice low and earnest, "I was a hollow man, a ghost in my own home. I wanted a duchess who would be quiet, sensible, and undemanding. I sought to purchase peace, to contract for an absence of chaos." He took a step closer, and her heart began to beat, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "But you, Ilara, you were never merely quiet. You were possessed of a deep and powerful stillness. You were not just sensible, you were wise, and you were not undemanding, not at all. You demanded, in your own steadfast way, that things should grow, that a forgotten garden should bloom, that a silent child should be heard, that a broken man should feel again." He reached out and took her hands in his. They were no longer the soft, useless hands of a gentlewoman, but the capable, slightly calloused hands of a gardener. He held them as if they were precious treasures. "This was never meant to be a marriage of love. It was a contract, a barren arrangement, meant to produce an heir. But I find that I have broken every one of my own terms. I am no longer interested in a marriage of convenience, Ilara." His gaze held hers, intense, unwavering. "I love you. I love your strength, your compassion, your quiet, unshakable spirit. You walked into the ruins of my life, and you began, with no fanfare and no expectation of reward, to plant a garden. I want to spend the rest of my life helping you tend it." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, tears of a joy so profound, so utterly unexpected, it was almost painful. The love she had secretly, cautiously nurtured in her own heart, a love she had never dared to name, was being returned to her 100-fold. "Oh, Alistair," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, I think I have been in love with you for a very long time." A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a smile of such radiant warmth and relief that it transformed him completely. It was the smile of a man coming home after a long and brutal winter. He raised one of her hands to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Then, framing her face with his hands, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of cold duty or sudden passion. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, of gratitude, of homecoming. It was a kiss that sealed not a contract, but a covenant. It spoke of shared sorrows and future joys, of quiet companionship and deep, abiding love. It was the kiss she had never thought to receive, from the man she had never expected to love. In the heart of the reclaimed garden, under the light of 1,000 stars, the plain overlooked Ilara, the Duchess they never thought would be, had finally, truly found her home. 1 year later, the sunlight that streamed through the windows of Blackwood Manor seemed to have a different quality. It was warmer, more golden, as if the house itself had finally exhaled a long-held breath of sorrow and was now breathing in pure joy. The corridors that had once echoed with silence now often rang with the sound of a child's happy chatter, punctuated by the deep, warm laughter of her father. Ilara stood on the terrace, overlooking the garden, a gentle breeze ruffling her hair. The garden was in its full, glorious maturity, a testament to a year of devoted care. It was a symphony of color and scent, a vibrant living heart in the center of the estate. A small hand slipped into hers. "Mama," Rosamond said, her voice clear and bright as a bell. The word, once a painful reminder of a tragic past, was now a simple, beautiful expression of love, offered freely to the woman who had brought her back into the light. Rosamond was no longer a silent wraith. She was a happy, thriving 7-year-old girl, her dark eyes sparkling with life and curiosity. "What is it, my love?" Ilara asked, smiling down at her. "Papa is coming," Rosamond announced, pointing towards the stables. Ilara saw him then, Alistair, walking towards them, his long strides confident and easy. He was no longer the formidable, granite-faced duke she had first met. The harsh lines of his face had been softened by happiness, the coldness in his eyes replaced by a constant, gentle warmth that was reserved only for his family. He saw them watching, and his face broke into the smile that still made Ilara's heart turn over. He came up the steps to the terrace and swept Rosamond into his arms, planting a kiss on her cheek which made her giggle. He then turned to Ilara, his free arm wrapping around her waist, drawing her close. Her own body was round and heavy with the promise of new life, and he rested his hand gently on the swell of their unborn child. "And how are my 2 duchesses this morning?" he asked, his voice a low, contented rumble. "We are very well," Ilara said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We were just admiring our kingdom." He looked out over the garden, then down at her, his eyes full of a love so deep and steady, it was the anchor of her world. "Our kingdom," he agreed softly, "built on the most stubborn and beautiful foundations I have ever known." Later that day they sat together on the stone bench in the garden, Rosamond chasing butterflies nearby. Alistair held her hand, his thumb stroking over her knuckles. "Do you remember," he said quietly, "the terms of our arrangement?" Ilara smiled. "Vaguely, something about being quiet, sensible, and undemanding." "I was a fool," he said, his voice laced with self-deprecating humor. "A blind, arrogant fool. I thought I could command my heart as I command my estate. I sought to build a fortress, and instead you cultivated a sanctuary." "We cultivated it together," she corrected gently. He brought her hand to his lips. "Everything that is good in this house, everything that has healed, is because of you, Ilara. You did not just restore a garden. You taught a man who had forgotten how to live what it means to have a home. You are the heart of this family, the heart of my life." The life they had built was not one of grand parties or glittering social triumphs. It was a quiet life, rooted in the rhythms of the seasons, the love of family, and the simple, profound joy of watching things grow. Flowers, a child, a deep and unshakable love. The dust of Hartwell House, the memory of her sister's scorn, the cold loneliness of her first days at Blackwood, it all seemed like a story that had happened to someone else in another lifetime. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the lawn, Rosamond ran to them, her hands full of daisies she had picked. She presented the makeshift bouquet to Ilara with a solemn flourish. "For the baby," she announced proudly. Alistair's arm tightened around Ilara and he laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated happiness that echoed through the peaceful garden. Ilara looked at her husband, at the beautiful child who called her mother, and felt the gentle kick of the new life within her. The scorned family beauty had sought a title and a fortune, but Ilara, the one they never thought would be a duchess, had found something infinitely more valuable. She had found a broken man and a shuttered house, and with quiet patience and gentle hands, she had healed them both, creating a love story far more beautiful than any rose in a garden all their own. Dear listener, have you ever felt overlooked, placed in a role defined by practicality rather than passion, valued for your quiet compliance rather than the silent strength you hold within? We often believe that worth is measured in loud pronouncements, in dazzling beauty or social acclaim. We are taught that to change the world, or even just our own lives, we must make grand gestures. But the story of Ilara and the Duke of Blackwood whispers a different truth. It reminds us that sometimes the most profound transformations begin not with a bang, but with the quiet decision to tend to a neglected corner of the world. Her power wasn't in her title or her beauty, it was in her patience, her compassion, and her courage to cultivate life in a place that had been surrendered to decay. She didn't demand love or respect. She earned it by creating a space where both could naturally grow. How many of us have a forgotten garden in our own lives, or in the lives of those around us? A place of past hurt, of neglected potential, of sorrow left to run wild. We may feel powerless to fix the grand, imposing problems, to mend the deepest wounds with a single act, but we all have the power to pick up a single tool, to pull a single weed, to plant one small seed of kindness. True strength is often quiet. It is the resilience to keep working when no one is watching, the compassion to see the pain behind a cold facade, and the wisdom to know that healing is not an event, but a season of slow, steady growth. So look for the gardens in your life that need tending. Be the one who brings the water, who turns the soil, who believes in the possibility of a bloom, even in the harshest winter. You may discover, just as Ilara did, that in healing the world around you, you are also cultivating the most beautiful and unexpected parts of yourself. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder of the power of quiet strength. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.